All right. Well, that brings us to the part in the show, which is where we get to introduce you to the guest speaker. So tonight we have Lyndal Harris. Lyndal is someone who we've known each other for a long, long time, but we lost touch, as a lot of people did over the COVID period, because we were no longer going to conferences and seminars that we sometimes used to go to. And I think we met at a WordCamp conference, which was for WordPress users, developers, and whatever, many, many years ago. But anyway, we've reconnected again. And Lyndal is a podcast VA. So she has been in this field for a long time. Well, actually, I shouldn't say a long time because that makes you sound old, but she's been in there for a while, and she helps people set up their podcasts. She helps them with the tech tools, helps them with the editing, getting them published across all of the platforms that are out there, choosing a platform that is going to be the most helpful one for you to do it. And she'll even do things like help with your intros, your outros, and the publishing of it so that you sound good. She'll help with the monetization of it. And really, she sort of helps with reducing the stress and the overwhelm that sometimes comes with managing all the different elements of a podcast, and creates it as a system and a done-for-you support service. So tonight, she is going to talk to us about how to do this thing called podcasting, and really give you some hints and tips and tricks there to really understand how this podcasting thing is a real thing and can really help you in business. So let's put our hands together and welcome to the stage, Lyndal. Welcome along.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, it has been. It was. I'm still trying to remember the year that we met at the conference, and I'm pretty sure I met you at 2 or 3 digital marketing conferences that
let's
year.
not go there.
Now, I'm just going to get my screens sharing so that you can see my presentation, and I'm going to give a couple of little heads up about tonight, because one, I've got COVID, so if I do by some means get into a coughing, I'm feeling okay, but if by any chance I start coughing or anything, you'll just have to excuse me. And two, being Halloween, of course, if people come by this house and ring on the doorbell, there's going to be dogs going off crazily barking. So I'm just going to say I'm sorry now. Funnily enough, if we talk about tech tools, if I was using this microphone here that I've left on the filing cabinet, it would pick up the dogs barking in the whole neighborhood. So I'm using a slightly different microphone tonight for that very reason. So it was great to hear everybody come on and do an introduction, and certainly let me know if you've got a podcast or if you're thinking about a podcast for your business. As Nick mentioned in the intro, I have been doing this now since 2016. I niched into podcasting, and I have been running my own business for about 11 years now. So a lot has changed in podcasting since I started. It was a much quieter sort of space, but it's still a great tool for your business if you're looking or you're thinking about launching one. So we're going to go through some of that info tonight. So what we'll run through is some of the things that you should be looking at to create a successful podcast, and so that you're not just putting more noise out there. How you can structure a podcast so that it's engaging and you're keeping your listeners hooked and wanting to listen to the end of the show. Finding your audience and growing your show, as well as monetizing your podcast. So first things first, we'll go back a step and say, what is a podcast? So a podcast is essentially, it's digital marketing or media files that are produced and published through platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other directories. So interestingly, I probably should change the order of those now, because YouTube is now taking over Apple Podcasts, and Spotify has definitely taken over Apple Podcasts. But generally, we're talking about audio files. Now, you will hear people talking about video podcasts as well, and we heard Vodcast said before, and they are hugely popular as well. But I think when we're talking about podcasts tonight, we're certainly talking more along the lines of the audio style. And you know, whilst the video side of things is growing and it is really popular, it takes away probably the one unique element of the audio podcast, which is that people are multitasking when they're listening. So, they can be multitasking when they're listening to a video, but they're not, they're not doing that while they're driving their car, while they're, at the gym or going for a walk or walking the dogs. So we'll talk, the information sort of will cover both video and audio. And certainly you can actually do the video and strip the audio out and actually create that onto platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify. So Spotify and YouTube do the video side of things. YouTube's an interesting beast here in Australia at the moment because it's still not playing the audio podcast, but I don't think we're too far off that. But they have got that in other countries where it's actually playing through YouTube Music, and hence you'll start to see Google Podcasts. You might have seen, if you're a podcaster, that is actually going to be closing down because YouTube is coming on board to take over the Google Podcasts that they've had going. So at the moment, as of today, there are 4,252,292 podcasts available in the podcast index. That number grew massively over COVID. Before COVID, the number was under 1 million. And now, even though we say there is 4.2 million available, the good news to that is in the last 30 days, only 350,000 of those, or 350,745, have actually released an episode. So about 8.5% of all of the podcasts that are available now are actually publishing on a consistent basis. And in the last 90 days, it was about 465,000, so around the 10%. So there is still a really good opportunity in podcasting. I know I get asked a lot, is it too busy? Are there too many podcasts out there? But when you look at that, that's still less than, the number of blogs that are out there and things like that. And the fact that not over 10% are actually publishing episodes consistently every month or every 3 months. And whilst I think you need to actually publish a little bit more than monthly, and we'll come to that as we go through the presentation, there's still a really good opportunity for you to get your message out there. So how to use a podcast for your business? Well, when we talk about podcasting, we want to look at educating people or entertaining people. But if you can do that crossover of both, then you've really got a good way to get your message out to many. So a lot of people, or a lot of the people that I speak to, and a lot of my clients over the last 7 years have been business podcasters. I've had the odd hobby podcaster, but majority have been business podcasters. And these are the main reasons they're launching a podcast. So to create brand awareness, to get their message out there, because we know now that people will stalk you online before they come and buy from you. So if they're thinking about doing a workshop with you, or they're thinking about buying your one-to-one service, they're looking at your social media, they're listening to your podcast. So building that brand awareness and getting your message out there is a great way to use a podcast. Position yourself as an expert in the field. So if you have services that you want to be an authority, a podcast is great for that. Building relationship with guests that you might otherwise not have a reason to reach out to. So for example, you might have an interview show where you want to, or it doesn't need to be an interview show only, but you want to interview people. If you've got a podcast and you can reach out and ask them to be a guest on your show, having a conversation with somebody for, say, half an hour, 2 hours, however long your interviews are, is a great way to build a relationship, which is a lot more intimate connection, I guess, than actually, sending messages through social media or emails and trying to reach out that way. You can guest on other shows and get in front of other people's audiences. And it's also a great content creating tool in itself. And we'll cover a little bit more of that as we go through. So why consider a podcast? And an audio podcast is what I'm talking about when I talk about these. It is a unique way to consume content, because there is no other way that you can be multitasking and and taking that content in. You can't be driving your car and watching a video. You can't be walking the dog and reading a blog post. So it really is a unique way, and it is an intimate way to build a relationship with someone who's choosing to put you either in their ears or on their car stereo when they're driving and listening to your message. So, you know, a lot of people will say to me that they've gone to conferences or they've gone to networking events, and if they've got a podcast, people actually feel like they know the host. So it is a great way to build that relationship. And when you meet people, they know about you, and especially if you tell stories and you weave in some personal stories and things like that, then it's another step of they feel like they know you. And it does help you to be or to become a better communicator. And some people, great speakers and great communicators, and that's great. I know for me, when I started my podcast, mine's 3 or 4 years old now. So, but I could get up and speak and present, but it really did help me become a better communicator or become more confident with my communication skills. So it can help with that as well. So we're going to run through some of the things that it takes to actually make sure that your podcast is successful, because it is easy to jump on the bandwagon sometimes and say, okay, I'm going to do a podcast, and then not really have thought through some of the steps of it. And that's why we see so many podcasts. When we look at those figures of how many podcasts are out there now and aren't publishing episodes, it's what we call pod fade. And that is why we see so many one of the reasons we see so many podcasts with pod fade is that they haven't necessarily sat down and done some of the work up front to really work out how it can funnel into your business and how to use it. And over the years, I've had the odd person just say to me, I'm just going to launch a podcast because I know that that's what people are doing and it's really popular. But if you haven't really thought about some of these steps that we're going to go through now, then it can just be a whole lot of work that ends up being a big headache. So the first thing that I always say to people is you want to start with the strategy. So the strategy is really, really important. The number of people that will come to me and say, I just want to know, what microphone should I get? Or that first step is thinking about the actual technical side of things. That sort of comes quite a way down the track. I would say to people, step back and actually work out the strategy. What is the purpose of the podcast? What is your goal? Why are you actually doing it? Who's the audience that you are trying to reach? Are you trying to build a community? Is it to monetize? Is it to become an authority? And think about your audience. Are they actually even listening to podcasts? So there are some great reports and stats that you can go and look at to see if your audience, your target audience, are listening to podcasts. And some we know straight off the bat are. Others you might want to go and do a little bit more research and see where they're listening or what types of social channels they might be on if you've got younger demographics. But yeah, really understanding that audience. And then if they are listening to podcasts, or if they're sort of listening to podcasts, but not as much as you, or the stats don't show as many, do you need to actually educate them on how to listen to a podcast? Because it might be that they're really interested in listening to your message and your content, but they might not know how to actually find that. So that might be part of your strategy when you're launching, is to actually educate the audience. So really think about the strategy first and then step into some of the next steps. And when we talk about discoverability, again, with 4.2 million shows on there, you want to make sure that you've thought about some of the key steps to make sure your show stands out from others. And I've got in these steps here, the name of the show, the tagline, and the description. So the name of the show, a lot of people actually sort of sometimes, I shouldn't say a lot do, but sometimes will stumble on the name of a show because there are a few different ways that you can name it. Now, if you're a personal brand, you might call it the Lyndal Harris Show. If that was my brand and my website's lyndalharris.com, then I might call it that. Another way to name it is to actually say it with a keyword in the title. So the actual title of my show is Podcasting Tips and Tricks, because I'm not building a personal brand. So I didn't really want to name it after myself, but I wanted to say very clearly what it is about. And the third way that you can name it is around a quirky word or have a quirky phrase, which is good and fun if you have a good tagline. But I think that works better for people that potentially have an audience already, because someone's not going to go into a podcasting app and search for that quirky word unless they actually know that that's the name of the show. So there's a few different things to think about when you're naming your actual podcast. Another tip on that one is, if you don't need to, don't have the word podcast in the title, because when people are searching for it, they use, and we'll come to it in the next slide, when they're using the app to actually search, some of the fields that they search is the name of the podcast, the title of the episode, and the author field. And if you put the name podcast in your show, there's something like 600,000 or 700,000 shows that have the word podcast in the title. So if you can get away with not calling it that, or having that in the actual name of the show, that's a bit of a tip there. You might use the word show instead of podcast. I mean, it's not a big deal, but it's just something to be mindful of if you're starting and you're looking to name your show. Tagline is just something short and sharp that explains the title if you feel like you need it that little bit more. And the description's really important. I see a lot of people just put one or two sentences into the description and not necessarily put much thought into it. But you don't need to write, pages in your description, but a few paragraphs that really outline what is your show about, what sort of topics are you going to cover, who is it for, and maybe a little bit about who you are. But just using the keywords, weaving keywords in there so that people, when they are searching for shows, they will come across it because you've written a good description with those keywords in it. Now, the research a couple of years ago and last year was showing that a lot of people do read that description. If they're looking for a new show, they will read that description. So don't sort of waste the opportunity to not put a good, clear description in there. More so now is you'll start to see trailer episodes. So the trailer episode sits at the top of Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and it's like a preview to Netflix, where you can actually click on a trailer episode, and it actually will outline the same thing. Now, it might actually be your description that you've recorded. It could be you reading the description, not wanting to sound like it's read, but reading the description, just outlining what the show's about. But just, make sure you put a little bit of effort into that description, because I do see quite a lot. I'll see one or two sentences that don't really, don't take advantage of that real estate. The next thing to think about is podcast SEO. And there is probably not a lot that you need to do as far as podcast SEO is concerned, but use keywords. So as I mentioned, when people are searching for a new podcast, they will often use the app itself to search. So they might be in Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and they might type in podcasting, probably a bad example actually, because but let's say online marketing or business coach or something like that. And that they do use the keywords. So they'll look at the name of the podcast. When I say they, I mean the apps. They'll look at the name of the podcast, they'll look at the title of episodes, and they'll look in that description field, but they'll also look at the author field. So a really good tip with the author field is often we'll just put our name. So we'll just put Lyndal Harris. But if you want to put a keyword in there as well after your name, so you might put Lyndal Harris and a line and then podcasting. Put a keyword after that author field. That can be another way to jump you up to the top when people have actually gone into the app to actually search for a topic on that. Google has come to the party. They've changed a little bit again, I think, in this year, that they were putting podcasts at the top of search of Google. You'd get some podcast episodes that they would highlight at the top of their search if you were just searching in the Google browser for something. I think they're changing that again. They've been a bit funny, Google. It's been an interesting journey to watch their how they play in the podcast world. But as I say, Google Podcast itself is shutting down. I think it's this month, and YouTube is taking over. So listen, you still can find information when you Google. So let's just put Google and YouTube because they are important for SEO. And the last thing I wanted to touch on there is transcripts. Transcripts are great for SEO. You need to weigh up, and I say this to all podcasters, you need to weigh up the cost of actually getting a transcript as opposed to the benefit of it. And with AI tools, I actually think that it is worth getting the transcript, but not spending too much time to make sure it's absolutely perfect. Now, you might have an audience that does want a transcript and does need a transcript, and that's actually a great way to provide that content for somebody who can't listen to a podcast. So absolutely weigh up whether you should be getting a transcriptionist or spending maybe a little bit more money with somewhere like rev.com, or using an AI tool to provide the transcript, and maybe just putting a little disclaimer at the top of the transcript that says, you know, done via AI. So people know that if it's done with AI, there might be a few errors in it, and they kind of forgive that. So just weighing up, but it is good for your SEO if you put that onto the web page. So you don't want to put it into your show notes in the actual podcast host. You'll actually want to use that transcript on your post on your website for that episode. Cover art. Cover art is really, really important. Most people, when they create their cover art, and you can find, you know, Canva have great templates. When you're creating your cover art, or you've got a graphic designer to do it for you, and you look at it on your computer screen, it's this great big image, and you think, yep, I love it. It looks fantastic. But you've got to remember that most people are actually looking at it as a thumbnail on their phone. So whilst we see it on the screen and it's a nice big image and the font looks great and, you know, the words look amazing, when you're looking at it in a thumbnail, it can be quite different. So think about, you have to have specific dimensions for Apple Podcasts and for Spotify and probably a lot of the other directories. It has to be 1400 by 1400 up to 3000 by 3000 pixels. Otherwise, they just won't accept it. But if you want to see what it'll be like in a thumbnail, you could drop it down to a 50 by 50 pixels, and that'll give you a good read of what it would look like on somebody's phone. You want to ensure that it's not too wordy and that it really pops out, because if they're looking at it in the podcasting apps, then you really do want to have one that pops. Now, I just wanted to put a cross section of samples there so that you can see what we're talking about when we're looking at cover art. And you probably recognize some of these, and some of them are great. They're really, they stand out, they pop. You know, BX, I know a fair few of you know BX and are through the BX network, so we can see that's really their branding. It stands out. Imperfect Action is Steph Taylor, and Steph has a podcast that she produces 3 times a week. It's a short, sharp few minutes. I'm sure a lot of you know it. Now, she's actually part of the HubSpot network. So you can see that with hers, she doesn't have an image of herself on there. She doesn't have her name on there, but she has a big following from when she used to do it. It used to be called Socialette, and she did build her brand that way. So there's different ways to do your cover art as to whether you want to put your face on it or not. And, you know, you'll have some people who'll say you don't need to, and you don't need to put your face on it. But some people like to. I think it really depends on the type of podcast that you have and whether you're, you know, trying to build that connection with the audience. So sometimes it's more relevant, other times it doesn't matter so much. But we can see here, you know, Kate Toon, James Schramko, Angela Henderson, they've got personal brands. So they've called, you know, they are on the actual cover art themselves, but you can see just how effective it is as well to have cover arts that don't have your picture on them. So the couple that I want to talk about here is My Dad Wrote a Porno. It is a really, really, you know, very successful podcast. And, you know, they've managed to have events and all sorts of that. They were really, really successful. And if that was my client, hold on a sec, that's gone back to, if I had a business client coming to me with that cover art, I would probably say it would be a little bit hard to read on on a thumbnail, but they've had massive success. So I don't want to sort of harp on about it, but you could see that the cursive writing could potentially be a little bit hard to read. And this bottom one here, now this one is really interesting because it doesn't have any words on it at all. And whilst the people who are subscribed to it and love the show, and I'm sure it's a great show, and it's not, I don't mean to take away from it, but it doesn't have the name of the episode. It doesn't have the name of the podcast on it. So that has to be really, really strong branding if you're not even going to put the name of the show onto your cover art. So there's just a few things to think about there, but just remembering, as I say, you want it to pop out, and generally people are going to be looking at them with a really small thumbnail. Now, to cover off just a couple of other bits and pieces before we look at structure and some of the other things, a couple of ingredients that you might want to think about is, a compelling story. So whether it's fact or fictional, if you can weave stories into your podcast episodes, whether it's business or not, then it connects a lot quicker. The unique voice. And I have so many people, especially now when there are so many podcasts out there, say, why would somebody want to listen to me? And people do want to listen to you because there might be, when I launched my podcast about podcasting, it was 3 years ago, I had exactly the same thought process. And I had been in the podcasting space for quite some time. And I thought, why would people want to listen to me? There's other podcasts about podcasting. And I nearly let all the imposter syndrome and the nerves and everything get to me. And I thought, no, I need to do this because that's, this is the space I'm in. And it was amazing how many people said, we wanted to hear from you. We wanted to hear your message. So I don't know if any of you watched Nick's video today on Facebook, but he said the same thing. People actually want to hear you talking about it. And then it goes back to what we said before about people do stalk you online as well too, if they want to buy your products and get to know you. And so you have a unique voice. You have a unique way of telling the message. And as far as the sound of your voice, don't worry about it because, like Nick said it perfectly in the Facebook video, we don't hear our voice the same way other people hear it. And I love talking to podcasters everywhere who say, oh, I've got the most terrible accent, or I've got the this or the that or the this or the that. People still tune in and they still listen. So don't let that stop you, because I know that is a very common reason or very common thing that I get when I'm talking to people about a podcast. And the other thing is good quality audio. With 4.2 million podcasts out there to choose from, yes, people will tune into your unique voice and they'll love your story. But if you have bad audio quality, they will tune out faster than they are listening. They are very, very picky now. And because you can get the tech side of things to set up to get good quality audio is not expensive. At the very least, I would say get a USB microphone and plug it into your computer and at least have the microphone. At least have your headphones as well. But with your headphones, you don't have to go and purchase over-the-ear headphones or anything like that. At the very least, you could put the headphones that you get with your phone, but you do want wired ones. And I'm going to pick my microphone up here because you can see, you can see I've plugged my headphones into here. Now this actually gives me the feedback that I can hear, if the dogs are barking or if there's a lot of feedback and what have you. So putting it back through the microphone is really good way. So, but again, you don't need to spend a lot of money on these. You don't need to spend a lot of money on a microphone. You can get a USB microphone for under $100, which is a really good starting microphone. One thing I would suggest is knowing where you're going to record. Are you going to record in an office? Are you going to record, going out and about and being mobile and talking to people at conferences more often than actually sitting down and doing it at your desk? And also being mindful that you might want to just do a little bit of research in the microphone, the types of microphones. So the microphone I'm using tonight is it's a microphone that basically is just picking up the noise here. And like I mentioned, because it is Halloween and I know the dog next door barks a lot and my little dog can be a little bit of a pain too, I actually am using a microphone that's picking up very little background noise. Now, this microphone here that is sitting on my filing cabinet behind me here, that is a much better microphone. I'm not going to lie, it gives a lot better quality audio. It has an XLR attachment, so I actually need to have something to plug it into my computer. It's not a USB that I can plug straight in, but that also picks up a lot of background noise. And if there's a dog barking next door and I don't want that, then that's I've got to pick and choose when I'm using that microphone. On saying good quality audio, don't get upset and hung up if you do have a dog barking in the background, because one, you can fix that with editing, and two, people are okay if there's some real sounds in it. Now, they don't want to hear that you don't have a microphone. They don't want to hear that you don't care about the quality of the audio. They don't necessarily want to hear you chewing on, I don't know, chewing gum or having glass with ice in it and what have you. But if there's a dog barking in the background for a little bit of it, there are ways to edit it out if you've recorded it well. And I just think people don't really mind if it just makes it a little bit more real. But be mindful that people do tune out if you don't have good quality audio. So that would be one of my biggest things there. So a couple of tips when we talk about overall, like a good launch strategy, be thinking maybe, I mean, you can turn it around. You can turn it around in a couple of weeks. You could turn a launch around really quickly, but have everything ready. Take your time. Don't rush into it. Have a good launch strategy where be everywhere. There's lots and lots of different apps that you can be on. So you can be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube. There's 27 or 28 other different apps that you can be on. And some of them aggregate from Apple Podcasts, some of them don't. So be everywhere is my tip. You may as well try and pick up every audience, every person that you can on the different directories, and use your analytics. And we're actually going to cover analytics a little bit further into the presentation, because sometimes people don't really look at them, and you can use them well to grow your show. So that's just a little bit about some of the things that you can think about to ensure that it is a successful podcast. We won't cover too much as far as the structure goes, but in every episode, or in most shows and business podcasts, I always suggest that you have a show intro and a show outro. So branded with a little bit of music. Don't make it long, particularly the intro, nice and short and sharp. Welcome to the such and such podcast where we talk about blah, 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 and be done within under 30 seconds, because people do skip through them. And if you've got that sort of 1 or 2 minute one, it's just, when people are tuning into your show regularly, they don't need to hear a 1 minute intro every single time. So keep that nice and short. Your outro wants to be something with a call to action in it, and generally one call to action per episode. And then in every episode, you have 3 elements. You have your introduction, your main content, and your conclusion. Now, with your introduction, when you start an episode, it's a really good idea to tell people upfront what they are going to hear in that show. Because if I've got somebody on my show, for example, and I'm doing an interview, and I don't actually start the episode by saying, here's what we're going to cover today, if you're not interested in the first 5 or 10 minutes and you don't know where this episode is going and you think that we're just going to ramble on, you're going to tune out. So if you tell the listener what they're going to hear up front in that first minute or so, then they might just say, oh, I want to hear that, or I want to know that information. So, in this episode, we're talking to Lyndal Harris about podcasting. She's going to cover the benefits of podcasting, the ABCs to have a successful podcast structure, and monetizing techniques. And then you can get into the show. So just give people a little bit of a hook and something that they can expect. Then into your main content, whether that's a solo show or an interview, and then you can have a conclusion. Some podcasters don't worry about the conclusion side of things because they'll just go straight into the outro, but you'll also find others choose to summarize an interview, if it's been an interview particularly, to summarize some of those key takeaways and to sort of lead in maybe with the topic for the next episode. But that's personal choice. Some other elements you can add in there. You've got listener questions, reviews, sponsorship messages. With listener questions, you can also get people to send a little voice question in so that you can actually drop that into the editing process, so you're not just reading their questions out. And then you can have all sorts of different segues and music stings to bring it all together. But when you are thinking about your structure and how it all comes together, some of those things that you really do want to think about is the storytelling, and how you can maybe apply it to each of your episodes, keep people interested. The episode length, I always get asked, what is the ideal length for a podcast episode? And there's no answer to that one. It really does depend on what your audience, who is your audience, what are they doing? Again, if you watch Nick's video today on Facebook, if you've got parents that are driving kids to school, you can say that roughly 15, 20, maybe up to 30 minutes is a good time. If you are, some Joe Rogan has a 3-hour show, 2 or 3 hour shows. So you really knowing your audience is important, but really not trying to say, I have a 20-minute show and make every single episode 20 minutes, because if you do that, sometimes you're actually filling in the time with stuff that's not really relevant, and people will notice that. So just don't try and fill it with fluff, I guess. If you're trying to, if you've got in your head that you think that there's an ideal length, just cover the content and let that be. And, again, I mean, I know I use myself as an example quite a bit, but I had podcast episodes that were 7 minutes long. I had interviews that were an hour and just over an hour long, and both of them got listened to just as much. So once you start to get to know your audience, you've got more episodes out, then you can start to see, how your stats. And as I say, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Outlining or scripting your episode. Some people don't worry about it. Some people might just use bullet points, and some people will script the whole thing. My only bit of advice is, if you script the whole thing, make sure that it doesn't sound like you're reading it, because you would have listened to, I'm sure you've listened to things that you feel like someone's reading, and you can tell the difference. So if you have scripted it, just be mindful of your tone and your energy that you're putting into it as well. And make sure you have a call to action in your podcast. So most of the time that people will have that in the outro, whether that is, sending them to your website for a download, or, make sure you subscribe and follow or share the show with people. What I do try to say to people in this part, particularly in the outro, try not to give 5 or 6 things for people to do, because then they just go, and they don't do any of them. So choose 1 or 2. So it might be, make sure you follow or subscribe to the show. And if you want more info, you can head over to our website or something. Just keep it simple so that you're not asking them to do, as I say, 5 or 6 different things. Otherwise, they don't tend to do any. Finding your audience and growing your show. This can be the fun part, because sometimes it's easy to come up with not easy, but it's once you get over the hurdle of how to actually record your podcast and what to talk about, it can be a bit of a challenge finding your audience. So the biggest thing is know where they are. Know if they listen to podcasts. Don't put a podcast out if your audience aren't listening to podcasts. And like I said, there are things that you can go and read to get statistics and analytics on who's listening to podcasts in Australia and all of that. Most of the age groups are. But again, not just in the podcasting space, in social media as well. Know where they are. Are they on LinkedIn? Or are they on Instagram, or are they on Facebook? Or you might find that they're on TikTok and there might be a crossover, but there's no point. It's like in social media. There's no point in spending all of your time doing Instagram reels if they're on LinkedIn. So just know where they are and start engaging with them in the podcast, but also in your social channels or in your email marketing as well. So building a community is a great way, using your stats to make sure that what you're providing your audience is relevant, and we'll touch on that a little bit. Marketing your podcast, I find a lot of people just hit publish, and once the show's out there, they don't realize that probably a lot of the work comes in when it comes to marketing your episodes. Cross-promotion with other podcasters, advertising your podcast, and repurposing your episodes. So this slide is really about knowing where they are, know where your audience are, and know where to engage with them. If people are part of a network, a podcasting network, then they've already got an audience sort of that other podcasters are going to promote. So, but if you're an indie podcaster, you're a smaller podcaster, you need to really know where they are. And we touched on that in the last slide, and know where to reach out and engage, because if they're more engaged with you in whichever platform is easiest for them to engage with you, then they're going to be more, listening to the podcast, but also maybe sharing it with other people as well. And you might have the perfect type of podcast to build a community. Some podcasters don't necessarily want to or need to build a community. Others do like to have the community and start from the very beginning. So when I started Podcast VA, I didn't actually start with a podcast straight away, and I had some personal reasons for that. But what I did do was I started a Facebook group called the Australian Podcasters Collaborative, and I just started to tell everybody that I was talking to, either networking or in potential client calls, clients, everyone. And I would just direct them, if they were podcasting and they wanted to be part of a community, into that group. Now, it doesn't need to be a Facebook group, it can be wherever. But if you think that it's a great opportunity to have a community off the back of your Facebook group, off the back of your podcast, then give them somewhere to go and give them somewhere to engage. And sometimes you might build that community or build that group and then realize that people aren't engaging in there as much as they do in other places on social media. So if that's the case, then it might not work for you. But for some people, that community is really a great place for people to go and follow you and engage with other listeners as well. So using your analytics to find your audience. This one is, I talk to a lot of podcasters that say, I don't really check my analytics. And I suppose when it comes to, having a look at your download numbers every week, some people think that it's great and others don't. So I'm not going to pretend that everybody does it and thinks it's fantastic. But the types of analytics that you will get through your hosting platform, and the hosting platform is somewhere, I realize I haven't mentioned it, but you when you set up a podcast, you have a podcast host. So you're not actually hosting it on your website, you're embedding everything onto your website through a hosting platform. And then you actually integrate that with all of the directories like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, YouTube, etc. That hosting platform will actually collect all of the analytics from everywhere it's pushed out to. So you don't have to go looking in different places, except if you want to actually get this consumption stats. So most of your hosting platforms will give you how many downloads, you can play with it by the episodes, by the time frames, weeks, months, what have you. Where are people listening? Most of the platforms will give you those sorts of stats. They'll all give you those stats. Some of them will vary in which level subscription you purchase through them. But if you want to see some consumption stats, and some hosting platforms do provide this, but Apple Podcasts, for example, you can actually log into Podcast Connect with your iTunes login and actually go and see the consumption stats. And that's showing you where people, or if people are listening to the whole episode. It gives you a percentage. So you'll have your episodes up there, how many people are listening, downloads, and then a percentage of how many people are listening to the whole episode. And that can be really, really helpful if you are starting to, I mean, obviously you need to have a few episodes live to be able to use the information, but are people dropping off at 40 minutes and not coming back in to listen to the end of the episode? Because if that's the case, then they are wanting, or your audience is perfect for a shorter show. You might as well be, you may put sponsorship messages at the end of your show. And if they're not making it to the end of all of your shows, they're not hearing what those sponsorship messages are. And they could be, you know, your messages, your call to actions back to you to something that you're promoting as well. So using those consumption stats can help you around the length of the episode, about how you structure where you're putting any ads or sponsorships or call to actions and things like that. But using the other stats as well, once you get a good variety of or a good number of episodes in or published, you can sometimes start to see a pattern of the types of topics that they're listening to, for example, and then you can start to structure your podcast production around giving them more on that topic. So yeah, make sure that you're looking at those regularly and seeing how that's building. Collaborations are really important for podcasting, and guesting on other shows and cross promoting are two things that I think are really a really good way for you to grow your show. Now, guesting on another person's podcast is actually the number one way for you to grow your podcast. So a lot of people think about bringing guests onto their shows that have got good audiences and what have you, but in actual fact, you going on to other shows with a similar audience, and most podcasters, you know, at the end of an interview will say, where can people find you? And where they can find you, that gives you the opportunity to promote your show. And cross promotions can work quite well as well. So for example, you'll hear cross promotions on shows that are on networks. So Steph Taylor does a cross promotion at the beginning of her show to another show that's on the HubSpot network. But that can also work for people that are not on networks. And it has worked really successfully with some of my clients, where they just say, hey, if you like this podcast, you should maybe tune into, and gives a little description on the person that you're doing that cross promo with and tells them about their show. So that might be worth looking into as well. Advertising, we probably won't touch too much on. We'll go into it a little bit again in monetizing it in a few slides time, but radio advertising, that really, I have that in there that because we do hear a lot of radio advertising, but those ones are usually for the radio's podcasts or the people that are on those networks. So realistically, business podcasters aren't generally doing radio advertising, but they can do online advertising with your, you know, Google ads, Facebook ads to reach a targeted audience. I know people do it. I don't know a lot of people that have had massive success with it, but it might be worth trying. But magazines can be a great area, especially if you've got a really niche show. So if there's a magazine that is around your niche, you could potentially put an ad in there for your podcast. But the tip with the magazines is that you could also find some really good sponsors for your show if there is magazines that are really niched in your area. So potentially having a look through those and then having a list of people that you go to see if they're interested in sponsoring your show. Marketing and repurposing. Well, it's, you know, I suppose repurposing is all about leveraging your time and effort. And I think there's one great thing that you can either repurpose things into a podcast, or you can use the podcast as your content creator and repurpose it into a whole lot of other things. And, you know, show notes, transcripts, social media posts and graphics, audiograms. Audiograms are the little short teaser videos that you often see that will have a snippet out, whether you see the video or if you just see it on a static image. That a lot of them are used in social media. Blogs, email marketing, you know, there's so many things, the webinars and presentations. I mean, I could strip the audio out of this presentation. I won't, but Mick could, potentially strip the audio out of this and make it a podcast episode. Lead magnets and email series. If I do have some of my podcast episode links in my email sequences that go out from people when they download a lead magnet. If you've got some episodes that you could then download and get the transcripts from, you can put it together and make an ebook. Obviously it needs a bit of work, but there's most of the content for it. Social media lives and videos. So there's so many different ways that you can be repurposing it all. And as I mentioned before, though, when you do have a podcast, don't sort of stop at that point of hitting the publish button. It goes out to the apps and then maybe putting one post on to say that it's live. Because if you if you think about social media and how few people see our posts, you want to keep marketing them, and especially if it's evergreen content. So I've got podcast episodes out now that are 3 years old, and I still have people listen to them all the time because they are evergreen. So if you've got evergreen content, it's a great opportunity to make sure that you're building that into your marketing as well. I'm flying through. I'm just watching the time. I think I've got a couple of minutes left before I hit questions. So I'm just going to fly through these because I'm pretty sure I've talked about most of it anyway. But yeah, ways to engage your listeners. If you've got the community, the social media, ask for feedback. Some of the best the content ideas that you can come is from asking your audience or asking on your Instagram stories or whatever, just asking people, what do they want to actually hear? Because if they give you the content and the topic ideas and things like that, and they give you the feedback and they engaged in asking you questions, then they're more likely to listen to it and they're more likely to share it as well. Monetizing your show. Yes, when we talk about monetizing, there are so many different ways, but I really just want to say for me, if you're a business podcaster, the easiest way to monetize your show is to drive the traffic back into your business, into the services that you offer or products, into workshops, whether it's one-to-one workshops or whatever you offer. If you're driving that traffic back into your business, you're monetizing it. It's funny how we sort of think when you talk about monetizing, we've got to have sponsorship and we've got to have advertising and what have you. But if you actually went out and put out to the podcast marketplace to put to get ads on your show, you have to have thousands of downloads per episode. And that doesn't happen with business podcasts. I mean, it might do for some people, but not a lot of people in the small business space who have a podcast are getting enough downloads to actually have that formal advertising sponsorship arrangement. So great way to do it, though, is for you to sponsor your own show. So my podcast is Podcasting Tips and Tricks, sponsored by Podcast VA. Just weave those little messages in and you'll find that there's a really good way that you can drop these in now called dynamic ads. And I'm just watching the time and I know that I need to sort of wrap it up, but there's some ways that actually you can drop these messages in to advertise your own business services or your own workshops, or if you have events that you're running. Subscriptions is another way you can make people pay to listen to your content. You can run events, you can have merchandise, and there's a whole lot of other ways to monetize. But really, if you're driving traffic back into your business, that is what it is all about. And I just put this in because I speak to so many people who feel like this when they think about podcasting. But at the end of the day, once you get past that overwhelmed nature of it, you get the technical side down pat, the launch feels like a mountain. But once you get into the actual ongoing process of it, it is very much, you can systemize it and it's very much the same process. It's a lot of work, but it's not hard work once you get your head around how it all works. And my last piece of advice is if you are going to do a training program or get some different resources and you want to learn how to do a podcast yourself, you can absolutely do that. But please do not go looking at 3 or 4 or 5 different people's pieces of advice, because there are so many different ways to do a podcast. I would say just buy one person's course, resource, blog posts, whatever you want to look at, and follow their their process, because otherwise you can get yourself really confused, because there are different ways to do it that have the same outcome. So yeah, that is me. That's what the sort of things that we covered, starting with strategy, think about the structure, engage your audience using your analytics, and have a look into the different ways to monetize your show. Does anybody have any questions?
Just checking out the comments there in the chat. Someone was asking, where did you get all your stats from?
Okay. So which stats did you, so there's the Edison review. Now I'm having a mental blank. Edison do a review every year in every country. And so they actually put it out. They're the ones that I generally look to as well. And then I also get other stats. If you ask me which one, I can tell you where, I might be able to tell you where, if you're asking about a specific one.
All right. So any other questions? Feel
yes.
free to unmute yourself, and we've got a couple of hands up as well too.
Yeah.
So I can see you.
Hello. I was just wondering about music. I downloaded some music to put on that was royalty free. Do you think it's necessary to have music every time, or music accompanying the back, behind your speech, or just at the beginning and at the end?
I think at the beginning and the end. I don't think you need to do a lot of putting it into music stings and what have you. Some people do a lot of that in their editing. It comes down to time, budget. I think if you've got a little bit of music at the beginning and the end, then that kind of does tie it in nicely, rather than just going straight in. Now, you could put that at the very beginning, and I'd say it's the show intro is what I would call it, where you just say, welcome to this, and it can be that 15 seconds. Some people just use a music fade and record it from the very beginning each time. And some people will chop a little bit, sort of, a bit of a teaser at the front and then go into the music. But I think the music does give it a bit more of a professional feel and sort of rounds it out with the branding. So certainly if it's a business podcast, I always suggest that, a bit of music is good.
Thank you.
Excellent. Azim, you've got your hand up.
I do. Thanks, Lyndal, for a wonderful presentation this evening. It's a bit like drinking from the fire hose, but you said something interesting about the monetization in terms of the number of downloads. And the business podcasts are generally not that high on the downloads. Obviously, if you've got a name in business, that's slightly different. I get that. So what is the area that has the highest number of downloads from your experience?
Do you mean which category of show?
Yeah, which category?
Yeah.
Personal development or what?
Well, I don't know how to break down the business category, to be honest with you, because I can tell you religion and sports, they are up there with the highest categories, the most listened to. Then, of course, you go into things like true crime and everything like that. From a business perspective, I don't think I don't know them, to be honest, on actual subcategories to answer that question. And I think it does come down to the audience, but I wish I had the stat, and maybe I'll go and dig it up for you after I hop off this call, because there is a stat that says if you get something like a few hundred downloads per episode, you're in the top 10% of podcasters in the world. So people think that they're going to get tens of thousands of downloads, because we do hear that happens on podcasts that are on networks, and we hear that happens on radio podcasts and bigger people like the Joe Rogans and Brené Browns and all of that. But from a business perspective, there are people who get thousands of downloads, but there are also people who get, say, 200 or 300 downloads per episode. And that is a really successful podcast as far as the stats are concerned. And it comes back to, again, if you were happy to go and stand in a room with 50 people every single week and talk to them about a different topic, would you be happy with that? So, some people say, I'm only getting 50 episodes or 50 downloads or 20 downloads. It depends on the person and their message and what are they happy with.
So to your point, if I were to, one of the podcasts I'm hoping to launch is around founding franchisors. So not necessarily the CEO, but the founding franchisor. So I'm already building a connection community across LinkedIn. So if I ended up, just as an example, if I ended up with 300 of those guys or 400 of those guys, and I was letting them know every time that there was a new podcast episode, which is obviously clearly relevant to them, then I may get downloads from my immediate community, which would actually make it a very successful podcast. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's, as I say, then going back to you to say, you know, even if you got 50 downloads per episode, is that still good? And I would think then too, that the conversations that you're having, and it would be evergreen. So never go away from the fact that people will be downloading it for months after it's live. So yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Thanks for your help. Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Aldrin.
Thank you, Lyndal. Really enjoyed that. My question is, what platform do you use to record your podcasts on?
So there's a few different ones that I recommend. Zoom is very popular. It is still, you know, probably about the 60% mark, but a couple of really good ones that have come in recently. One is Riverside FM. The other one is Squadcast. And they actually, you know, then you've got Zencaster. Zencaster's been around for quite some time, but Zencaster dragged their heels a little bit, I think, coming into the video side of things. So I know they're probably three very popular ones for podcast recording. Riverside FM and Squadcast do the video very well. If you'd have asked me this question about 3 months ago, I would have said Riverside FM is my favorite because it is great. Squadcast is up there because they have now partnered with Descript, and Descript is a very amazing AI editing tool, and it will give you the transcript. You can actually import your video and your audio and edit it from the transcript, so you're not actually having to look at the audio file or the video to actually do your editing. So if there's a whole, you know, a section that you want to remove, you can highlight it in the transcript and delete it from there. And Squadcast have partnered with Descript. So I think that that's a really powerful partnership, to be honest. But Riverside FM I do love as well. And funnily enough, Zoom today, I was saying to Nick just before I jumped on the call that Zoom, my menu looks slightly different because Zoom have added in their AI options as well. And I don't know if you've all got that, but certainly I've got the AI summary, the AI companion down the bottom. So when we hang up this call, I mean, this is Nick's recording, so I'm not sure if it's set, but I know if it was mine, you could have hit the AI summary and basically it gives you your show notes. So it summarizes the actual, and that's just come on today for me in Zoom. And I put it on for a consultation I had earlier. And as soon as I hung up and did the leave meeting, I had a summary of what the whole call was about. And I think that's really powerful. So Zoom is very popular still. It's really good, but it gives you a slightly tinnier, I'm going to say slightly tinnier than Riverside, Squadcast, Zencaster, because it's not quite at the same bit rate that it's recording.
Right, thank you.
Stephen.
Yeah, just one quick thing. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
If I may add something, what I found was if you're consistent in your podcasts, like the same time every week, again and again and again, that's when your audience tends to grow. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, I love that. That is very true. And weekly or fortnightly, don't go monthly. If you go anything less than fortnightly, it just does not get the traction. And I know that people are listening to a whole lot of different podcasts and what have you, but if you really want to grow your show, that is exactly right, Stephen. That is one of the key things, is you have to be consistent. Pick when you're going to publish that show, whether it's weekly or fortnightly, and stick to that schedule. People won't mind if, you know, something happens and you a couple of hours later, or, you know, there's sometimes, you know, things happen, life happens, but when you start publishing on a Monday and then in 3 weeks' time you put it on a Thursday, and then maybe the next week you do it on a Monday, it confuses the audience. They like to have consistency.
Yep, thank you.
Actually, just a follow on to that, too, Lyndal, there's a question in the chat from Paul there. In fact, there's 3 questions from Paul. What's the best scheduling? Like, what's the best regular time slot? well, now and then. I think you've just answered that, sort of having something consistent there. Steve mentioned that. But also, how far ahead should you have your guests planned? And what do you do if you run out of guests?
I love that question. Guests can be amazing, can't they? When life happens, let's just say life happens. The more ahead of schedule, the more you've got in the bag, the less stressed you are going to be, because, you know, people do get sick. People do have, you know, I don't know, kids that get sick, and it's legitimately things happen. My way around that, my suggestion is, if it can work for you, I think a really good way to do your podcast is to have solo episodes and guests. Because then if the worst comes to the worst and you're really scrambling for a guest, you can pop a solo episode in. But that is dependent on your show, and that's not going to be relevant for everyone. But what I generally say to people is, if you're starting your podcast and part of your strategy or your objective is to build your brand awareness and build yourself as an authority in the space, don't do a solely interview show, because that is very easy to shine the light on other people and not really highlight what you do. So if you are doing it for that purpose, I always think it's good to have a combination of solo shows and interviews. And then that way, if guests do pull out or, you know, things happen, you can actually drop a solo episode in and no one will probably really know. Even if you were quite sort of, I do a solo, then an interview, a solo, then an interview, people aren't really going to think it's, well, what's happened? He's just put another solo episode out. So I think that is one way around it, if it fits your particular podcast and your strategy.
So would they be pre-recorded?
Yes. So most of this I am talking about pre-recorded. Yes.
Okay. So even your interviews, you wouldn't go live with them?
I wouldn't. A lot of people don't. And I know, for example, we're live streaming this, and Nick does that with his webinars. But with podcasts, I think a lot of the guests are not necessarily expecting to be going live. In fact, they're not expecting to be going live. And if they are going live and they don't mind, then that's okay. But I think batching can be really handy for getting ahead of the schedule as well. But I would, do you have a show, Paul? Sorry, no. Okay, so a lot of people will be pre-recording. I'm going to say those interviews that you hear, most of them, they'll be pre-recording and then just tidying up a little bit in edits, even if there really isn't much editing, but pre-recorded and then published.
Now, I've been a guest on a couple on video podcasts, which have been edited because for some reason, some people think I talk too long. And we go on for a 30-minute show and 90 minutes later, we're still going, you know.
Well, you and I should definitely not get on it too, because I was flying through my info at the end there because I realised I could go off on so many things when I start talking podcasting.
Yeah, and I've been on radio a couple of times as well, which obviously is live, but you know, the thing I struggle with is how to dream up who would be a guest if I was to do it, you know, and even if I got both of the people that I could think of, that's two, not something sustainable for one a fortnight for the next 100 years.
But do they have to be interviews?
Again,
goes back to that objective.
Yeah.
And Con's just dropped something good into chat there, and that's to say that I put a post up on Facebook or LinkedIn, and you'll never be short of guests. And there are places on social media there which are specifically for podcasts and for asking for guests and for guesting on shows as well too. So there is probably lots of stuff, I think.
Absolutely. If you're a podcaster or you're thinking about doing a podcast, I do have, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be promotional or anything, but I do have a community of podcasters with about 2,500 Australian podcasters in it. So I often try and encourage that in the group as well. Just, you know, ask for podcasters or see if there's someone you can align with or collaborate with in there. But yeah, there are plenty of different groups and guesting, and there's businesses that help you line up guests and have, connect you with people as well.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Lyndal, for your session tonight, and particularly that you're down with COVID. No one could ever tell. There was no coughing fit, so you did very well. So you're a professional podcaster because you keep that coughing fit inside until the end.
I actually don't feel too bad. I can feel like COVID was like, I don't feel too bad, but yeah, I've definitely tested positive. So I'm glad that didn't happen.
Excellent. So where's the best place for people to get in touch with you or find out more about what you do after the show? And of course, you've muted yourself for the most important part.
Don't you love it? See, audio people, they do it as well. I was having a giggle when you did that at the beginning, saying that to people, because I was like, I do that all the time. And I just thought I'd show you that, everyone does it.
Demonstration successful.
Absolutely. Podcastva.com. Head over to my website, and I'm also active on LinkedIn as well. So you can reach out to me on any of the socials, but podcastva.com is my website, and you can certainly contact me through there.
Excellent. Now we do have a door prize tonight as well too, which you've kindly offered up. So why don't you tell us about that?
So tonight I'd like to offer a Pick My Brain session, which is 20 minutes, and we'll say 20 minutes to half an hour. I'm quite okay with that. And I picked that because I figure some of you might be podcasters and some of you might not be podcasters and want to talk about an idea of podcast. So 20 to 30 minutes on a call with me, picking my brain about anything podcasting.
Excellent. All right. Well, we've got a special way of drawing this. As we always do, we've got our wheel of names. So the way this works, everybody's name is in the wheel of names. And remember, you need to be in the room to win. I've heard a couple of people drop out. So if they do win, you're still in with a chance to win it as we redraw it. So let's hit the wheel and let's find out who our lucky winner is for tonight. And virtual drum roll. There's it. That's it. Can you believe it? The winner there, full sheet. You asked for a 20-minute session. This is going to be 3 hours with both of you.
Okay, I need to put the timer on. You need.
Did you see my suggestion, Paul, for your show name in there?
Did you see my reply?
Not yet. I stream dead people.
Yeah, the Paul Sheaf show where we shoot dead people with multiple cannons.
I'm going to hear all about this, aren't I?
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again, Lyndal, for coming along tonight and sharing with us all of your wisdom. Let's give Lyndal a huge round of applause, virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
And of course, if you want to listen to this again, it will be up on the SmashGo YouTube channel tomorrow afternoon. If you're not a subscriber there, now's a good time to head on over and click that subscribe button. When you do start to enter your name, a little bell will appear. If you click on that, then you'll get a notification when the episode has been uploaded. And of course, feel free to share that with your friends, your colleagues, anyone else that might be interested in this as well too. And again, if you're not a member of the Business Owners Smashing an Online Facebook group, go there and join that, because of course the replay will be there as well too, because we've been live streaming it to that platform as well. And also remember Lyndal's, get in contact with her at podcastva.com. So once again, thank you everyone for coming along tonight. Hope you've taken away some things that are going to be helpful for you and your business. And I look forward to subscribing to some new podcasts as they come out. Go and have a sensational evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On a Tuesday night.
Thank you. Night.
See you.